There are moments in history when humanity becomes intoxicated with possibility. The map grows larger, the telescope sees farther, the microscope sees smaller, the factory works faster, the computer thinks quicker. Every generation discovers another locked door and convinces itself that this one, finally, is meant to be opened. And every generation finds a key. We celebrate the turning of the lock. We applaud the brilliance that made it possible. We immortalize the inventor, the scientist, the engineer, the restless souls who refuse to accept that some questions should remain unanswered. But history has an odd habit of asking a second question. Not could you, but now that you have, what comes next? We are remarkably good at creating things whose consequences we only begin to understand once they're standing in front of us. A machine that outworks the craftsman, a medicine that prolongs life but transforms death, a weapon that ends one war while threatening every future one, an intelligence that can imitate the words before it can understand our hearts. The miracle always arrives first. Responsibility limps behind. Maybe that's one of the oldest flaws in our species. We fall in love with beginnings. We're captivated by first steps, first discoveries, first triumphs. But creation's only the opening chapter. The harder work begins after the applause has faded, when the thing we've made starts changing the world in ways we never anticipated. What exactly do we owe the things we bring into existence? Parents wrestle with a question, nations wrestle with it, inventors wrestle with it. Even artists know the strange feeling of releasing something into the world only to discover it no longer belongs entirely to them. Some creations become blessings, others burdens. Most become something in between. The unsettling truth is that our creations remain rarely as we imagine them. They grow beyond us. They disappoint us, they surprise us, and occasionally they confront us with uncomfortable reflections of ourselves. And when they do, our first instinct is not often to embrace them, but to look away. There was once a young man who believed the greatest achievement imaginable was to conquer the boundary between life and death. He possessed intelligence beyond his years, ambition without restraint, curiosity powerful enough to eclipse caution. History remembers him not because he failed to create life, but because he failed to understand what creation demanded of its creator. His greatest mistake was never playing God. It was forgetting that every act of creation carries with it an act of responsibility. And 2 centuries later, as we teach machines to reason, reshape genomes with astonishing precision, and build technologies capable of changing civilization itself, his story feels less like an old Gothic tale and more like tomorrow morning's newspaper. His name was Victor Frankenstein, and tonight we return to him. Welcome to the Midnight Chapter. I'm D. William Graves. Some books just don't belong on a shelf. They belong on your nightstand, ready for you to crack it open at any moment. But not because they're frightening, although Frankenstein certainly has frightened generations. Nor because they're influential, though few novels have left fingerprints on our culture as deeply as this one. They endure because every age eventually discovers that the questions buried inside them were never really buried at all. They were simply waiting for history to circle back. We often imagine progress as a straight line stretching confidently through the horizon. We invent something remarkable, congratulate ourselves, continue marching forward. Looking back feels unnecessary, almost quaint. Why consult a 19th century novel when quantum computers, genetic engineering, and AI seem to be rewriting the future in real time? Because human beings have always sprinted toward tomorrow carrying yesterday's instincts. Our tools evolve with astonishing speed. Our nature evolves at a glacial pace. Quite a dichotomy. The stone axe became the steam engine. The steam engine became the microchip became a neural network capable of writing poetry, diagnosing disease, and holding conversations that would have seemed impossible only a generation ago. And yet the hands holding these inventions rarely are mistaken for anything but human. The same hands capable of compassion, the same hands capable of greed, the same hands that long for recognition, fear failure, crave control, and sometimes mistake power for wisdom Technology changes the scale of our decisions. It rarely changes the heart making. Perhaps that's why stories outlive civilizations. Empires collapse, borders shift, languages disappear, libraries burn, yet somehow the questions survive, migrating from one generation to the next inside of myths, novels, plays, and poems. Literature's always been humanity's longest memory. It preserves not only what happened, but what it felt like to be the sort of creature capable of making those things happen. That's a different kind of history. Dates tell us when. Stories ask why. And if we're willing to listen, they sometimes ask a more uncomfortable question. Why do we keep doing it? It's tempting to believe that our age is uniquely complicated. Every generation thinks it stands at the edge of unprecedented change. The printing press must have felt revolutionary. So did electricity. So did the splitting of the atom. Today, artificial intelligence occupies that same space in our imagination. Depending on whom you ask, it's either the dawn of a new renaissance or the opening act of an existential crisis. History suggests it's probably neither, or maybe it's both. The real danger has never been innovation itself. Curiosity is one of humanity's finest qualities. Not so much for the feline, but without it we'd be staring across rivers instead of building bridges. We'd still fear eclipses instead of predicting them. We'd still mistake disease for curses instead of searching for cures. But curiosity is not the villain. Neither is ambition. Neither is imagination. The trouble begins when success convinces us that accomplishment is the end of the story. It almost never is. Every invention creates new responsibilities. Every discovery reshapes relationships. Every breakthrough asks something of the people who celebrate it. Progress doesn't simply expand what we can do. It expands what we're accountable for. That's true whether you're talking about social media platforms that reshape public discourse, algorithms that influence the news we consume, laboratories editing the human genome, or autonomous systems making decisions once reserved for people. We tend to ask whether these creations work. We spend far less time asking what kind of people we must become to use them wisely. The question isn't confined to laboratories or boardrooms either. Parents create families. Teachers shape minds. Authors release stories. Leaders build institutions. Every one of us leaves something behind that continues affecting people after we've stepped away. Creation is one of the most ordinary things humans can do. Responsibility is where we often falter. That's why Victor Frankenstein still feels less like an eccentric scientist from a Gothic novel and more like an old acquaintance whose mistakes have become uncomfortably familiar. He isn't interesting because he crossed a line no one else dared to cross. He's interesting because he reacted the way many of us might when confronted with the unintended consequences of our own success. His laboratory may belong to fiction, but his instincts do not. So, before we talk about monsters, laboratories, lightning, or stitched together bodies, it's worth hovering over the question that's echoed through 2 centuries of scientific revolutions, industrial revolutions, digital revolutions, and now whatever revolution comes next. What do we owe the things we create? If you'd wandered through Europe in the closing years of the 18th century and the opening decades of the 19th, you would have sensed that the world had slipped its old foundations. Not all at once, not with a single revolution, invention, or declaration. More like a great glacier finally beginning to move after centuries of stillness. For generations, people had lived in a universe that seemed ordered. Kings ruled because God permitted them to rule. The church explained the heavens. Nature obeyed laws that were mysterious but dependable. A person's station in life was often assumed to be as fixed as the mountains surrounding them. Then, almost within the span of a single lifetime, everything began changing. Governments fell, empires rose, machines multiplied, certain ancient certainties cracked. The modern world was being born, and like most births, it was both miraculous and terrifying. The Enlightenment had encouraged people to believe that reason could illuminate nearly every mystery. Philosophers questioned inherited authority, scientists questioned inherited explanations, explorers redrew maps that had remained unchanged for centuries. Humanity was becoming increasingly confident that if a question existed, It could eventually be answered. That confidence was intoxicating, but it also contained a subtle danger. Once you begin believing that every mystery can be solved, it's only a matter of time before someone decides every boundary can be crossed. Imagine the excitement of the era. Electricity was no longer merely lightning striking distant trees. It was becoming something that could be studied, demonstrated, perhaps even harnessed. Public exhibitions drew fascinated crowds who watched sparks leap between metal conductors. Scientists passed electrical currents through the limbs of dead frogs, watching muscles twitch as though life itself were hesitating to depart. To modern audiences, these demonstrations might seem quaint. We fly in airplanes every day and we think nothing of it, going hundreds of miles per hour, thousands of feet above the sky, and we're just along for the ride. To those witnessing these things for the first time, they bordered on the supernatural. If a dead frog's leg could move, what else might be possible? The Italian physician Luigi Galvani believed electricity revealed something fundamental about living tissue. His nephew, Giovanni Aldini, expanded those experiments dramatically. In one famous public demonstration in London, electrical current was applied to the body of an executed criminal. Witnesses reported jaws trembling, limbs jerking, faces contorting. Some spectators genuinely believed the corpse might stand. Today we understand these reactions as muscle contractions. Imagine not knowing that. Imagine watching death itself appearing negotiable. The line separating science from magic had grown astonishingly thin. But electricity wasn't the only force reshaping society. Factories began replacing workshops. Steam engines transformed travel, and cities expanded faster than anyone could fully understand. Families who'd spent generations farming the same fields suddenly found themselves working beside enormous machines whose rhythms cared nothing about sunrise nor harvest seasons. For the first time in history, technology wasn't simply improving life, it was changing the pace of life. That's a difference every generation eventually encounters. The internet did something similar. AI may be doing it again. When technology changes faster than culture, people experience a peculiar form of vertigo. Old rules stop fitting, new rules haven't yet emerged. Society becomes suspended between worlds, some sort of purgatory. That suspension produces remarkable creativity. It also produces anxiety. The Romantic movement arose partly as a response to these transformations. While industry celebrated efficiency, Romantic writers wandered into forests. While factories measured production, poets measured awe. While science dissected nature into understandable pieces, artists insisted that mystery still possessed value. And this wasn't a rejection of knowledge, it was a plea for humility. Human beings, the Romantics believed, were more than machines. Nature was more than raw material, and emotion mattered alongside reason. Wonder deserved its place beside calculation. It's easy to caricature the conflict of science versus poetry, but that misses the deeper tension. Both sides were searching for truth. They simply disagreed about whether truth could fully be measured. That disagreement has never disappeared. Today we debate whether algorithms understand beauty, whether data can quantify happiness, whether consciousness might someday be simulated inside silicone. Our own vocabulary has changed. The underlying questions have not. Religion occupied a similarly uncertain place during this period. Faith remained powerful, yet scientific discovery increasingly challenged long-standing assumptions about humanity's place within creation. New geological findings hinted that Earth might be vastly older than many traditional interpretations allowed. Astronomers expanded the known universe. Natural philosophers uncovered patterns once attributed solely to divine intervention. For many people, this wasn't liberating, maybe more disorienting. If nature operated according to the discoverable laws, where did miracles belong? If humanity could understand creation, what distinguished understanding from control? Those questions reached beyond laboratories. They settled into ordinary homes. Parents wondered what kind of world their children would inherit. Sound familiar? Workers feared machines replacing livelihoods. Political leaders worried revolutions spreading across borders. Intellectuals argued over whether reason alone could produce a just society. Ordinary people navigated all these uncertainties while still trying to earn a living, raise families, survive famine, survive illness, bury loved ones. History often remembers extraordinary events, but life is mostly composed of ordinary days lived beneath extraordinary circumstances. Maybe that's why literature matters so much. It preserves the emotional climate of an age. Not simply what happened, but how that uncertainty felt, how possibility tasted, how fear stayed right there underneath optimism. One of the era's defining contradictions was its simultaneous confidence and insecurity. Never before had humanity possessed such faith in its own ingenuity, yet that confidence coexisted with profound unease. Every breakthrough seemed to create another moral dilemma. Every solved mystery uncovered two new ones. Progress wasn't removing uncertainty, it was relocating it. And that pattern feels remarkably familiar. Today we celebrate breakthroughs in AI while worrying about misinformation generated at unprecedented scale. We edit genes capable of eliminating inherited diseases while debating where treatment ends and enhancement begins. We carry devices connecting us instantly to nearly every corner of the planet while wondering why loneliness remains so widespread. The inventions differ. The emotional landscape feels strangely recognizable. Each generation inherits remarkable tools. We all decide what kind of peoples are going to wield them. There's another feature of this historical moment that's easy to overlook. People genuinely believe they were living at the edge of a new era. Not unlike us. It's tempting to think our age is uniquely transformative, yet history is filled with people convinced civilization had reached a decisive turning point. Sometimes they were correct. More often, they correctly sensed change while misunderstanding its destination. No one standing beside these early electrical experiments could have imagined magnetic resonance imaging, cardiac pacemakers, or global power grids. And we can't fully imagine what today's emerging technologies are going to become 2 centuries from now. That uncertainty is part of the human condition. We invent first, we understand later, sometimes much later. And so this world, a world balancing reason against wonder, invention against restraint, ambition against humility, certainty against mystery, did more than produce remarkable discoveries. It produced a new kind of human being, someone convinced that impossible things might become possible, someone willing to cross boundaries previous generations regarded as sacred, someone whose imagination outran the moral vocabulary available to describe its consequences. It is from that restless, electrified, exhilarating, deeply uncertain world that one ambitious man emerged. And it is to him that we now turn. Victor Frankenstein is often remembered for a single act. He created life. It's an astonishing achievement, perhaps the greatest any human being could imagine, and yet if you were to spend enough time with Victor, not as a symbol or a literary device, but as a person, that accomplishment begins to shrink in importance. The creation is only the moment history remembers. The man himself is revealed everywhere else. Because Victor isn't simply a scientist. He's the sort of person we've all met. Perhaps we've been him. He's the brilliant student whose talent arrives long before his wisdom, or the employee whose ambition earns promotion after promotion until one day the work owns him instead of the other way around. The entrepreneur convinced that if he can just finish his next project, the sacrifice will finally make sense. Or he's the parent who dreams so intensely about providing a better future that he slowly disappears from the present. Victor is driven by an appetite that masquerades as virtue. He calls it curiosity. Others call it genius. But the line between the two is thinner than we'd like to admit. There's something deeply admirable about people who refuse to accept the limits of their age. Every great advance in human history began with someone willing to ignore the comfortable consensus. If everyone accepted inherited wisdom without question, we'd still believe disease floated through the air as punishment from unseen spirits. We'd still be afraid of eclipses. We'd think they were omens. We'd still accept suffering simply because previous generations had. Progress requires stubborn people willing to ask embarrassing questions, willing to look foolish. Victor Frankenstein possesses that courage in abundance. The tragedy is that courage alone is never enough. Spend a little time listening to him, not merely to what he says, but what he notices. And an interesting pattern is going to emerge. He rarely speaks about improving ordinary lives. He doesn't dream about feeding villages or curing childhood illnesses. His imagination isn't drawn toward easing burdens already carried by other people. Instead, he's captivated by something grander. He wants to conquer, not nations, nature. He wants to conquer nature. He speaks of death as though it's an engineering problem waiting for a sufficiently gifted engineer. He looks at the oldest certainty humanity's ever known and quietly decides whether it ought to be negotiable. That impulse feels pretty modern. Silicon Valley often speaks the same language. So do billionaires investing fortunes into longevity research. So do companies racing to build artificial general intelligence before their competitors. So do scientists pursuing breakthroughs that promise to redefine what it means to be human. None of these pursuits are inherently wrong. Many are hopeful, profoundly hopeful. They all flirt with the same temptation. When does solving problems become conquering limits? And when does conquering limits become confusing power with wisdom? Victor Frankenstein never asked these questions. I guess more accurately, he asked them far too late. One of the most revealing things about him is what he sacrifices without seeming to notice. His health deteriorates. His friendships fade into the background. His family becomes little more than just cherished memories interrupted by letters. Days disappear into months, months become years. The lab slowly replaces the world outside it. Obsession just walks through the door. It's disguised as dedication. Ask anybody who's built a business, anyone who's pursued a doctorate, anyone who's written a novel, anyone who's worked 80-hour weeks believing it was only temporary. There's a peculiar intoxication that accompanies meaningful work. At first it feels noble. You're building something important. You're sacrificing now so others may benefit later. You reassure yourself that once this project is complete, balance will return. But projects have a way of breeding new projects. Goals multiply. Success expands the horizon instead of satisfying it. Victor doesn't take one morning and decide to abandon ordinary life. He just postpones it again and again until ordinary life no longer recognizes him. Psychologists today sometimes describe this process as narrowing. Under prolonged obsession, the mind gradually excludes competing priorities. Relationships become distractions. Sleep becomes inefficient. Leisure feels irresponsible. The world contracts until only one objective remains visible. From the outside, such people often appear extraordinarily disciplined. From the inside, they're becoming prisoners. But Victor mistakes imprisonment for freedom. That misunderstanding lies near the heart of his character. Then comes the moment everyone remembers. The impossible becomes possible. The lifeless stirs. The great experiment succeeds, and Victor is horrified. That reaction deserves maybe some study, because it's profoundly strange. He spent years pursuing exactly this outcome. Why recoil the instant it arrives? Maybe because imagination permits control, and reality demands relationship. It's one thing to change the world in your dreams. It's another to discover the world has been changing you in return. Most parents confess something similar after the birth of a child. It's not horror, certainly. It's maybe overwhelming realization. It's an abstract idea of parenthood suddenly becoming a living human with needs, unpredictability, and claims upon your future. Business founders experience it. Artists do. Political leaders do. Creation always seems simpler before the created thing begins making demands. There's a Spanish phrase that says, "No es lo mismo llamar al diablo que verlo llegar." That means it's not the same thing to call on the devil and to see him arrive. But Victor wanted triumph. He inherited responsibility. Those are not the same gift. And his response reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. He runs, not physically at first, emotionally, morally, spiritually. Avoidance becomes his preferred language. It's difficult not to notice how often intelligent people rely upon avoidance. We postpone difficult conversations, ignore troubling reports, silence inconvenient truths, convince ourselves that problems unattended somehow become smaller. Usually they become larger. Victor hopes distance will absolve him, as though responsibility weakens with every step taken away from it. History offers endless variations on this mistake. Industrialists once dumped waste into rivers, believing someone else would eventually solve the pollution. Technology companies built platforms optimized for engagement before asking what constant engagement might do to public discourse. Governments have postponed addressing obvious crises before immediate discomfort outweighed future consequences. The pattern repeats because responsibility is rarely exciting. Creation receives headlines. Maintenance receives calendars. Maybe that's why so many remarkable achievements eventually become cautionary tales. Victor also possesses another deeply human characteristic. He consistently casts himself as the victim of circumstance he helped create. It's not unnatural. Most people narrate their own lives pretty generously. It's that main character syndrome. I think we all know it. We judge ourselves by motives, but others experience us through outcomes. Victor Frankenstein intended greatness, but those around him inherit grief. Notice how often he frames events as things happening to him rather than through him. It's a subtle distinction, a revealing one. Responsibility often begins with grammar. I caused this instead of this happened. There's another contradiction worth considering. Frankenstein generally loves people. He isn't cruel. He cares deeply for his family. He treasures his friendships. He experiences profound guilt. None of this resembles the caricature of a cold-hearted mad scientist, which I guess that makes his failures more unsettling, because they remind us that catastrophe doesn't always originate with malicious people. Sometimes it begins with decent people whose ambitions eclipse their awareness. History is crowded with individuals convinced they were improving humanity while overlooking the human being standing directly before them. Good intentions are comforting. They're also inefficient. They're insufficient. And then there's pride, not the theatrical arrogance. It's just something a little quieter, more respectable. Victor Frankenstein believes himself uniquely qualified to decide which boundaries deserve crossing. That is such a seductive belief. Experts sometimes fall into it. Leaders sometimes follow it. Authors probably do as well. I may be doing it now. But there's comfort in believing intelligence grants immunity from ordinary mistakes, because it does not. If anything, intelligence often manufactures more persuasive justifications. A brilliant mind can construct elegant explanations for deeply flawed decisions. And Victor Frankenstein excels at explanation. Reflection proves harder. What fascinates me most, though, is not his intellect. It's his loneliness. It's not just physical isolation either. It's existential isolation. He gradually becomes the only person carrying the full weight of what he's done. Secrets create peculiar prisons. They separate us from those who might otherwise help bear our burdens. Every concealed truth quietly rearranges the architecture of a person's inner life. And maybe that's why confession exists in so many cultures. Maybe it's not simply just to be forgiven, but maybe for companionship. And Frankenstein denies himself that possibility. He chooses solitude again and again until solitude begins choosing him. And it's difficult to know precisely when tragedy becomes inevitable. Was it the first experiment? The first sleepless night? The first rationalization? The first decision not to tell someone what he was attempting? Lives rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they are rode through countless small permissions that we grant ourselves. Just this once. Just one more day. Just one more breakthrough. Just one more compromise. Eventually, those small decisions accumulate into a person scarcely recognizable from the one who began the journey. Victor Frankenstein never set out to become a cautionary tale. He set out to become extraordinary. And perhaps that's the defining contradiction at the center of his life. He believed that creating life would make him master over his creation. Instead, the act of creation revealed how little he understood about responsibility, humility, and himself. His greatest failure was not scientific. It was profoundly human. He wanted the glory of bringing something new into the world, but he never stopped to ask whether he possessed the character required to live with what he made. The temptation is to believe that Victor Frankenstein's story belongs to laboratories. That would make things wonderfully convenient. If his greatest mistake required lighting, anatomy tables, and possible scientific breakthroughs, most of us could safely admire the story from a comfortable distance. We could close the book believing we are nothing like him because none of us plans to stitch together a body in an attic and breathe life into it. That's the peculiar power of literature. The details become outdated, but the people do not. Strip away the Gothic atmosphere, remove the scientific language of the early 19th century, forget the castle, the storm, the corpse. What remains? A person who became so consumed by creating something extraordinary that he never considered what his obligation would be after succeeding. Now the story feels uncomfortable, because we've all created something. Maybe not life itself, but something. Parents create children, teachers create opportunities, authors create stories, politicians create laws, entrepreneurs create companies, programmers create software, scientists create discoveries. Even our everyday conversations create relationships that did not exist before we opened our mouths. Creation is not rare. It's one of the defining characteristics of being human. Maybe that's what separates us from nearly every other creature on Earth. Beavers build dams, birds build nests, but humans build futures. We imagine things that don't exist and slowly drag them into reality. It's an astonishing gift. It may also be our greatest source of trouble. I wonder whether we've become so fascinated with innovation that we've forgotten stewardship. Those two words don't often appear together anymore. Innovation sounds exciting. Stewardship sounds like paperwork. Innovation gets magazine covers. Stewardship gets committee meetings. Yet history suggests the second matters a little less. Consider Alfred Nobel. Most people know his name because of the Nobel Prize, an award celebrating humanity's greatest achievements in science, literature, and peace. Fewer remember why it exists. Nobel accumulated tremendous wealth after inventing dynamite. His invention was practical, safer blasting for mining, construction, and infrastructure. Like so many inventions, it promised enormous benefit. It also transformed warfare. Legend holds that after mistakenly reading his own obituary, one that condemned him as the Merchant of Death, Nobel began asking a question many creators eventually confront. How will history remember what I've made? Whether every detail of that story is perfectly accurate almost doesn't matter. The deeper truth certainly is. Creators eventually lose control over their creations. That isn't an exception. It's the rule. The printing press spread literacy. It also spread propaganda. Television educated millions. It also entertained them into passivity. The internet democratized information. It also democratized misinformation. Artificial intelligence may someday cure diseases that have haunted humanity for centuries, but it may also generate deceptions sophisticated enough to undermine our confidence in truth itself. The same invention often carries both possibilities. It isn't because inventions possess morality, it's because people do. Technology amplifies human intention, it doesn't replace it. That's an important distinction. Whether conversations about AI become heated, you'll notice something curious. People rarely spend very much time talking about algorithms. They talk about us. Can we trust the companies build them? Should governments regulate them? Will they replace workers? Will they deepen inequality? Will they reshape education? Notice what's happening. The technology quickly fades into the background. The discussion becomes one about human judgment. Maybe that's inevitable. Every important technological conversation eventually becomes an ethical conversation. Frankenstein never realized this, or perhaps he realized it too late. His imagination outran his moral vocabulary, and history contains countless examples of that phenomenon. Splitting of the atom, genetic engineering, social media, facial recognition, none of these began with evil intentions. Most emerged from curiosity, optimism, and just hope, genuine hope. But hope alone doesn't determine outcomes. Imagine introducing electricity to someone living 1,000 years ago. They might conclude you've mastered the gods. Introduce social media to someone living in 1850. They might conclude every human being has become a newspaper publisher. Introduce AI to someone in 1950. They might conclude consciousness itself has been manufactured. Perspective changes everything. Sometimes I wonder how future generations are going to describe our moment. Maybe they're going to laugh at our anxieties the way we smile at early fears surrounding railroads or quicksand. There was once genuine concern that traveling faster than 30 miles per hour might damage the human body. History can make intelligent people look wonderfully naive, but maybe they'll judge us differently. Maybe they'll wonder why we built immensely powerful systems before reaching broad agreement about the responsibilities accompanying. Maybe they'll ask why profit often arrived before ethics. Maybe they'll wonder why we mistook speed for wisdom. Then again, maybe every generation asks those questions about the one before it, which raises another possibility. Maybe wisdom has always developed more slowly than invention. That thought kind of humbles me. Human beings have crossed oceans before learning to live peacefully with neighboring tribes. We discovered nuclear fission before learning to eliminate famine, created the internet before figuring out how to have civil conversations inside of it. Our capacity to build has always exceeded our capacity to govern ourselves. It's not an argument against process. It's an argument for humility. Humility rarely receives the attention it deserves because it feels passive, but it isn't. Humility is the discipline of remembering that intelligence has limits, that good intentions have blind spots. Every breakthrough creates responsibilities invisible from the starting line. It's easy to admire people who ask, can this be done? History is transformed by people willing to ask a second question, should it? And perhaps an even more difficult third question, if we do this, who becomes responsible for what follows? Those questions have no simple answers. They never have. But maybe that's precisely why Victor Frankenstein refused to remain trapped inside the 19th century. He wasn't the first person to create something beyond his understanding. He certainly won't be the last. The settling possibility is that the laboratory wasn't the real setting of the story at all. The lab was only the stage. The real drama unfolded inside the oldest workshop humanity has ever possessed, the human mind. If the human mind is the workshop, then perhaps the most dangerous tool it possesses is an intelligence. It's rationalization. Very few people wake in the morning intending to become the villain in someone else's story. History certainly contains monsters, men and women who embrace cruelty for its own sake, but they're rarer than we'd like to believe. Most of the damage done throughout history has been carried out by people who could explain themselves. They had reasons, they had goals, they had priorities that felt, at least to them, entirely reasonable. And that's a deeply unsettling realization, because it means the line between wisdom and disaster isn't always drawn between good people and bad people. Sometimes it's drawn between people willing to question themselves and people who stop asking questions once success begins. Victor Frankenstein is hardly alone in that regard. Think about the great cathedrals of Europe. They required generations of labor. The men who laid the foundations knew they would never see the finished towers. They created something whose completion depended upon humility. They accepted that there was just only one chapter in a much longer story. Now compare that to our own age. We often celebrate disruption. Move fast, break things, scale quickly, exit early, leave your mark. There's nothing inherently wrong with ambition. Civilization depends upon ambitious people. Roads are not built by the complacent, and timid salespeople have skinny children. Medical breakthroughs don't emerge from people content with the status quo. But somewhere along the way, ambition quietly changed its object. Earlier generations asked, what can I build that will outlive me? Now we often ask, what can I build that will elevate me? The difference is subtle, but the consequences are not. One points towards stewardship, the other toward legacy. Legacy isn't necessarily selfish. Most of us want to leave the world a little better than we found it. We hope our children remember us fondly. We hope our work mattered. We hope that in some way, even if it's a small way, our lives echo beyond our final breath. There's nothing wrong with that. The danger comes when legacy becomes more important than the people living inside it. How many parents have unintentionally sacrificed relationships while trying to provide a better life? How many leaders have justified terrible decisions because history would eventually vindicate them? How many artists disappeared into their work, convinced the masterpiece waiting at the end would somehow repay the years they never got back? The strange thing about obsession is that it often disguises itself as virtue. Society often applauds obsessive people, until it doesn't. We admire Olympic athletes whose lives revolve around fractions of seconds. We celebrate entrepreneurs sleeping beneath their desks. We tell stories about scientists forgetting to eat because they're so immersed in discovery. We romanticize total commitment. Then we express surprise when those same patterns produce isolation, burnout, broken families, moral blindness, and maybe it's because we celebrate obsession, because we confuse intensity with purpose. They're not always the same thing. A person can devote extraordinary energy to the wrong destination. History offers painful reminders. The Manhattan Project assembled one of the greatest scientific minds, some of the greatest scientific minds ever gathered in one place. Many of those physicists genuinely feared Nazi Germany would develop an atomic weapon first. Their urgency was understandable. Then the bombs were built. The war ended. A different question emerged. What now? Some scientists spent the remainder of their lives advocating for nuclear restraint. Others argued deterrence had preserved peace. Decades later, reasonable people still disagree. But notice the pattern. The difficult questions didn't arrive before the invention. They arrived after. Progress has a habit of postponing its moral examination until after success has already become irreversible. We're seeing echoes of that pattern today. Artificial intelligence is advancing with astonishing speed. Some researchers urge caution, others warn that excessive regulation could prevent breakthroughs capable of saving millions of lives. Investors see opportunity. Workers worry about displacement. Government fears being left behind. Who's right? Maybe all of them. History rarely grants us the comfort of simple villains or flawless heroes. More often it presents competing goods alongside competing dangers. That complexity frustrates us because we'd rather solve ethical problems than inhabit them. But maturity often means resisting the temptation to force certainty where none exists. There's another aspect of Victor Frankenstein's character that deserves our attention. He believed responsibility began and ended with intention. If his motives were noble, surely that counted for something. Of course it counts. It simply doesn't count for everything. Intentions belong to us. Consequences belong to everyone touched by our decisions. Parents understand this instinctively. A father can intend to prepare his child for hardship while unintentionally teaching fear. A teacher can intend to challenge students while unintentionally humiliating one who needed encouragement. Love and harm are not always opposite. Sometimes they occupy the same decision, separated only by outcomes we fail to anticipate. That realization demands something uncomfortable. It asks us to measure ourselves not only by what we meant to do, but what we actually produced. That's harder, much harder. It also requires listening. Victor Frankenstein rarely listens. He speaks, he decides, he concludes, he acts. Listening would just slow him down. Listening often does. In a culture addicted to speed, listening feels inefficient, yet nearly every meaningful relationship depends on it. Imagine if every major invention required its creators to live with its consequences for 50 years before receiving a praise. Would they build differently? Would investors fund different ideas? Would politicians legislate differently? Would authors write differently if they knew exactly how future generations would interpret their words? It's an impossible thought experiment, but useful nonetheless, because it reminds us how profoundly time changes our perspective. The people most excited about an innovation are rarely the same people living with its longest consequences. Perhaps that's why older civilizations place such value on elders. Not because age automatically produces wisdom, but because experience reveals patterns invisible to youth. Frankenstein possessed brilliance, but he lacked perspective. That's a dangerous combination. Then again, isn't every generation guilty of believing it finally understands what previous generations failed to grasp? The Romans thought they had civilized the world. The Victorians believed industry would solve poverty. 20th century promised that technology would eliminate drudgery and usher in an age of leisure. Instead, many of us carry tiny glowing machines in our pockets that allow us to answer emails while standing in line for coffee. Progress solved one problem. It invented several others. Maybe that's simply the rhythm of civilization. Every answer creates a new question. Every solution rearranges the landscape, and then every creation changes its creator. Which brings us to a possibility that Victor Frankenstein himself never fully considered. Perhaps the greatest responsibility we owe our creations isn't perfect control. Perhaps it's remaining humble enough to let them teach us what they reveal about ourselves. Because inventions are mirrors as much as they are tools. Artificial intelligence reveals how we think. Social media reveals what captures our attention. Nuclear weapons reveal our capacity for self-destruction. The printing press revealed our hunger for ideas. Every creation exposes something that was already waiting inside of us. Maybe that's why stories like Frankenstein continue to feel so unnervingly current. The monster changes with every century. The creator never really does. There's another possibility worth, not glossing over. What if we've misunderstood the word creation altogether? We tend to reserve it for the spectacular, the invention that changes civilization, or the novel that survives centuries, the company that reshapes an industry, the child born into the world. Those are certainly acts of creation, but they're not the only ones. Every day we create realities for other people. A manager creates a workplace. A pastor creates a congregation's understanding of grace. A politician creates expectations. A journalist creates narratives. A teacher creates confidence or insecurity. A parent creates the emotional climate of a home. Even strangers create moments that stay with you long after we've forgotten them. Think about the person who believed in you before you believed in yourself. They created something. They didn't create it out of electricity or stitched flesh. They did create it out of words. Now think of someone who humiliated you decades ago. Someone whose careless remark still echoes unexpectedly when you're alone. But they created something too. Human beings are consistently and constantly making worlds for one another. Which means Victor Frankenstein's mistake isn't confined to laboratories either. It happens in living rooms, boardrooms, classrooms, churches, courtrooms, and Congress. Everywhere people possess the power to shape another human life. But perhaps the question isn't simply, what do we owe the things we create? But it's also, what do the things we create owe the people who inherit them? Constitutions outlive their authors, and corporations outlive their founders. Religions outlive the prophets. Books outlive their writers. Algorithms may outlive their programmers. That realization changes the conversation because legacy is no longer about being remembered. It's about accepting that people you'll never meet may spend their lives navigating decisions that you made. History is so intimate that way. We still live among the choices of people who died centuries ago. The layout of our cities, the languages we speak, the laws we inherit, the wars still shaping international borders, the forests that are cut down, the rivers redirected, institutions preserved, injustices ignored, freedoms defended. Every generation enters a world already under construction. We didn't pour the foundation, but we inherit the house. Sometimes we renovate it, sometimes we reinforce its walls. Sometimes we discover that earlier builders concealed dangerous cracks beneath fresh paint, and sometimes we're the ones leaving hidden cracks for someone else to find. It's tempting to imagine history moving steadily upward, each generation wiser than the last. Reality feels more like a conversation. One generation asks questions, the next attempts answers. The generation after that discovers the answers created entirely new questions. Maybe civilization isn't a monument. Maybe it's an unfinished manuscript. That thought makes me wonder if Victor Frankenstein makes me often imagine him standing alone in his laboratory, but maybe he's not alone at all. Maybe he's surrounded by every ambitious person who ever believed accomplishment exempted them from reflection, by every executive who ignored warning signs because quarterly profits looked promising, or every government convinced temporary emergency powers would remain temporary, by every inventor who assumed someone else would just solve the ethical problem later, or by every one of us who's ever said, "I'll deal with the consequences when they arrive." How often do we say, we'll cross that bridge when we get there? It's a remarkably human sentence. We say it all the time. I'll apologize tomorrow. I'd rather ask for permission or forgiveness than permission, or how's the saying go? I'll spend more time with my family after this project. I'll slow down after this promotion. I'll start taking care of myself next month. The future becomes a warehouse where we store responsibilities we don't wish to carry today, until one day the warehouse is full. Frankenstein's tragedy wasn't created in a single night. It accumulated. One postponed conversation, one ignored responsibility, one rationalization after another. It's how most tragedies unfold. Not dramatically, but gradually, which raises an uncomfortable question. If we'd been standing beside him in that laboratory before everything unraveled, would we have recognized the danger? I'd like to believe I would. Probably would too. History gives us reason to be skeptical. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to mistake momentum for inevitability. Once enough time, money, reputation, and hope have been invested in a project, stopping begins to feel impossible. Psychologists sometimes call this the sunk cost fallacy. We continue because we've already continued. Nations remain in unwinnable wars. Businesses double down on failing strategies. Relationships limp forward because too much time has already been invested. We tell ourselves we're being resilient. Sometimes we're simply afraid to admit we should have stopped. Victor never really stops to ask whether success itself has become the problem. He only asks whether success is possible. There's a big difference there. One question belongs to intelligence, the other to wisdom. The age-old adage is the difference between intelligence and wisdom is that intelligence is knowing that tomatoes are a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put tomatoes in fruit salad. But civilizations need both. Our age celebrates intelligence almost obsessively. We rank everything. Schools, we measure productivity, track engagement, count followers, optimize performance. We possess metrics for almost everything, but wisdom refuses management. How do you quantify restraint? How do you calculate humility? How do you graph compassion? Maybe that's why they're so easily neglected. The things most essential to civilization are often the hardest to measure, and you cannot improve that which you do not measure. Trust, integrity, mercy, patience, responsibility. None appear neatly on quarterly reports, but without them, even remarkable achievements begin to corrode. There's an old saying that character is what you do when no one is watching. I wonder if responsibility is what you do after everyone stopped applauding. Creation is exhilarating. Maintenance is repetitive. Innovation is glamorous. Stewardship is ordinary. And yet civilization survives because countless people quietly choose stewardship over spectacle. Parents who keep showing up, teachers who prepare one more lesson, doctors who sit beside one more patient, engineers who expect one more bridge, authors who spend years revising a manuscript no one has yet to promise to publish. Perhaps greatness isn't only found in creating remarkable things. Maybe it's found in remaining faithful to them long after excitement has faded, long after those dancing shoes have lost their shine. That's the part of Victor Frankenstein's story that we don't often discuss. It's just far more demanding. Anyone can dream about chasing the world. Living responsibly inside the world you've changed, that requires a different type of courage. Which leaves me with one final thought before we move on. Imagine just for a moment that Victor Frankenstein had succeeded in every way he intended. Imagine his creation had been beautiful, healthy, grateful. Imagine history celebrated him as a man who conquered death. Would he then be remembered as a hero? Almost certainly. But would that automatically mean his choices were wise? History has a habit of confusing successful outcomes with sound judgment. Sometimes we're fortunate despite ourselves. Sometimes our failures expose flaws that success would have hidden forever. That possibility stays with me, because it suggests that the most dangerous creators might not be the ones whose inventions fail. They may be the ones whose inventions succeed so completely that no one pauses to ask what was quietly surrendered along the way. And perhaps that's the oldest tension in human history. We spend our lives asking whether we can create something extraordinary. Far less often do we ask whether we are becoming the kind of people worthy of what we create. I don't know what Victor Frankenstein ever truly got out of that. I don't think he ever answered that question. I'm not sure we have either. And that may be why his shadow still falls across every age that dares to call itself modern. If stories survive because they continue describing us, then perhaps the most unsettling question isn't whether Victor Frankenstein still exists. It's whether we've become so accustomed to his way of thinking that we no longer recognize it. Not the labs or the lightning, the mindset. There's a quiet assumption woven into much of modern life that every problem is ultimately a technical problem. If we can gather enough data, build a better algorithm, invent a more sophisticated machine, write a smarter policy, or engineer a more efficient system, then surely we'll solve whatever troubles us. And sometimes we do. Vaccines eradicate diseases, and bridges span impossible distances. Satellites predict hurricanes days before they make landfall. AI helps doctors identify cancers invisible to the human eye. These are extraordinary achievements, and they do deserve admiration. But every remarkable solution seems to uncover another question waiting patiently behind it. The internet connected billions of people. Why do so many of us still feel isolated? Social media gave everyone a voice. Why does it sometimes feel more difficult than ever to have a conversation? Productivity software allows us to accomplish in hours what's once required days. So why do so many people feel they never have enough time? Maybe progress is less like climbing a mountain and more like walking through an endless hallway. Every door we open reveals another. And that's not failure. It's simply the nature of being human. We always have mistaken the next answer for the final answer. The 19th century believed industry would usher in prosperity. The 20th century believed technology would free us from drudgery. The 21st century increasingly believes intelligence itself can be automated. Each belief contains truth. Each also contains a quiet temptation. The temptation to confuse capability with wisdom. Those are not the same thing. We often speak as though wisdom naturally follows information, but experience suggests otherwise. Never in history have ordinary people possessed access to so much information, so much knowledge. A device small enough to fit in your pocket can answer questions that once required months spent inside great libraries. Yet certainty seems to be growing faster than understanding. How is that possible? Because maybe information answers questions. Wisdom changes the person asking them. They are entirely different processes. You can download information in seconds. Wisdom usually arrives through failure, through humility, through consequences, through discovering that reality stubbornly refuses to cooperate with her confidence. Victor Frankenstein's tragedy wasn't that he lacked information, it's that he mistook knowledge for maturity. That pattern did not disappear with it. It simply became easier to disguise. Think about the language we use today. We talk about scaling ideas, optimizing relationships, disrupting industries, leveraging attention. Even our vocabulary often treats human beings as systems waiting to be improved. There's usefulness in that perspective. There's also danger, because people have an inconvenient habit of refusing to behave like machines. A company can be reorganized. A family cannot. An algorithm can maximize efficiency. It cannot decide what efficiency is ultimately for. The same tension appears in places we'd never think to look. Sports, for instance. Modern athletics are awash in data. Every movement is measured, every heartbeat tracked, sleep patterns, nutrition, biomechanics, recovery metrics. Performance has become a science. Athletes are better prepared than at any point in history, and no matter how you want to look at it. The worst NFL player today vastly outdoes the best from 80 years ago. Championships are still won and lost by things that resist measurement: composure, trust, leadership, the willingness to sacrifice personal statistics for a teammate. The numbers matter. They simply don't explain everything. The same is true in business. Companies spend enormous resources predicting consumer behavior. They analyze purchasing habits, browsing histories, demographic trends, and engagement metrics with astonishing precision. Yet, markets continue surprising experts. Why? Because people remain gloriously consistent. We buy things for emotional reasons and explain them with logical ones. We claim to value authenticity while rewarding performance. We insist money isn't everything until a better offer appears. Human beings are difficult to model because we rarely understand ourselves as clearly as we'd like to believe. That realization should probably make us more humble. It often makes us more determined. Perhaps that's another enduring problem. Whenever reality doesn't fit our models, we usually assume the models need refinement. Not that reality is teaching us that there are things that our models can never capture. religion encounters this tension, so does science, and so does politics. Each offers valuable ways of understanding the world. Each becomes dangerous when it begins believing its own vocabulary is sufficient to explain every aspect of the human existence. Maybe that's why the oldest wisdom traditionally spends so much time talking about humility. Not because humility limits discovery, but because it protects discovery from human arrogance. The most interesting people I've ever met share one characteristic. They remain genuinely surprised by the world. The more they learn, the more aware they become of what they don't know. The opposite almost seems true. People absolutely convinced they understand everything rarely ask good questions. Victor Frankenstein stopped asking good questions. He became fascinated with answers. That temptation feels especially modern. We live in an age where certainty is rewarded. Social media favors confidence over caution. Outrage spreads further and faster than nuance. A decisive opinion attracts more attention than an honest admission of uncertainty. I don't know rarely goes viral. Neither does it's more complicated than it appears. Yet, those may be the beginning of wisdom. Sometimes I wonder what kind of culture we'd create if curiosity were rewarded as generously as certainty. What if admitting uncertainty wasn't viewed as weakness? What if changing your mind was considered evidence of growth instead of inconsistency? What if our greatest innovations weren't measured solely by what they allowed us to do, but by whether they also made us more thoughtful, more patient, more responsible? Those aren't technological questions, they're human ones. And maybe that's the point. The tools surrounding us have changed beyond anything Victor Frankenstein could have ever imagined. The people using them, I'm not so sure. I keep returning to that image. A room lit by uncertain light, a table, a man standing alone with a question no generation before him had answered. For all the stories we've told about Victor Frankenstein, maybe we've spent too much time looking at the table and not enough time looking at the man standing beside it. He wasn't extraordinary, but his circumstances were. His ambitions were. His opportunities certainly were. But his heart was painfully familiar. It wanted to accomplish something remarkable. It wanted to leave its mark. It wanted to push beyond the limits inherited from previous generations. There's something deeply beautiful about that impulse. Civilization depends on people unwilling to accept that tomorrow must resemble yesterday. Without them, we'd still feel the dark. We'd still fear the dark in the same ugly way. We'd still accept needless suffering as inevitable. We'd still mistake impossibility for permanence. Creation is not the enemy, nor was it ever. What lingers is everything that follows. Quiet mornings after the celebration, the years after the breakthrough, the ordinary Tuesdays when remarkable inventions become ordinary responsibilities. History remembers discoveries. Life remembers consequences. And maybe that's why the story will never disappear. Not because we remain fascinated by monsters, but because we remain fascinated by ourselves. We keep asking whether machines will become more human. The older question may be whether humans will remain fully human while surrounded by increasingly remarkable machines. There is a difference. One asks what technology is becoming. The other asks what we are becoming. Those questions are easy to confuse. Walk by any city today. People move with astonishing inventions in their pockets. Invisible conversations cross oceans in seconds. Ideas travel faster than armies once marched. Entire libraries accompany us to the grocery store. Children grow up speaking casually to machines capable of answering questions that would have humbled kings. What an astonishing age, and what a dangerous age. Not because our tools are unprecedented, every generation eventually says it, but because every powerful tool asks something of the person holding it. Patience, discipline, humility, responsibility. The tool itself cannot provide those things. It only reveals whether they were already there. Victor Frankenstein discovered that too late. Maybe every generation discovers it too late as well. I wonder sometimes whether history is less like a staircase than a shoreline. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. Names change, governments change, languages evolve. Machines become smaller, buildings become taller. Questions remain astonishingly familiar. How much power is too much? What should never be built? Who bears responsibility once creation escapes its creator? Can wisdom ever keep pace with intelligence? We answer them. Then our children ask them again. Maybe that's why stories survive. Not because they preserve the answers, but because they preserve worthy questions. Somewhere tonight, someone is beginning a project they believe will change the world. Someone else is accepting a promotion. Someone is writing the first page of a novel. Someone's launching a company. Someone's holding a newborn child for the first time right now. Someone is training an artificial intelligence that will someday speak to strangers that they've never met. Most of them believe they're beginning something. Perhaps they are. Perhaps they're also inheriting something. An obligation, a relationship, a future they can't yet imagine. Victor Frankenstein remains waiting in that dimly lit room. He's not trapped there. He's just waiting, patiently. And he isn't asking us to fear creation, nor reject ambition, nor even to slow down. He's simply standing beside the oldest question any creator eventually hears. Now that you've brought something into the world, who will you become because of it? And I suspect that question will outlive every machine we ever build. It will outlive every government, every company, every invention. Someday, generations not yet born may look back at our age the way we look back on his. They might smile at our confidence. They might marvel at our ingenuity. They may wonder how we could have missed what now seems so obvious. And maybe after all that time has passed, they'll pull an old story from a forgotten shelf. They'll meet a familiar young man standing in a room lit by uncertain light. They'll recognize something of themselves in him, and they'll discover, as we have tonight, that some archives are never truly closed. They simply wait for another generation to open them. And now we close the midnight chapter. Now that the archive has grown quiet again, the lamps burn a little lower, the dust settles somewhere behind us. One old volume has returned to its place, though perhaps not quite as we found it. There are always more rooms, more shelves, more forgotten names waiting patiently in the dark. At Lacandon Jungle Press, the archive continues beyond this chamber. There are original books published under the press, works by featured authors, new and used, books carrying voices from other times and places, and literary essays and articles for those who enjoy wandering deeper into the strange machinery of stories. There are free short stories tucked among the collections as well, along with materials devoted to literature, storytelling, horror, mystery, and dark fiction for writers preparing stories of their own. There are publishing services meant to help bring new manuscripts out of silence and into the hands of readers. And because every long night among the shelves deserves something warm nearby, there is Café La Cachetona, our signature coffee, roasted for readers, writers, and those who have never quite learned to fear the dark. You can explore at ljpbooks.com. No need to hurry. The archive has been waiting for a very long time. Until our paths cross again among the shelves, this is D. William Graves. The archive remembers.